Hi everyone. So I'm Jorge Chapa, as Jason said, and I have been at the Green Building Council for more than a few years. You may have seen me in other events. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about sort of what are the big trends that we're seeing in the built environment. Then I'm going to take all of those trends and bring them all the way down to individual products and materials. And I'm going to show you how we at the Green Building Council of Australia are trying to drive that change. So one of the big trends that we're seeing now in products and materials is very much the introduction of the concept of circular economy. It's something that we've been talking a lot about in the past 5 years, but it's really this past year where it started to become into its own. And that's an important one to consider. But first, before we go there, what is the Green Building Council of Australia, or who are we? We're an industry association. We came out of the Sydney Olympics, the first Green Olympics, if everyone remembers that. And we have 4 core functions in Australia. We rate through Green Star. We advocate to local, state and federal governments for better building practices. We educate. We train a lot of professionals or do events like this where I'm speaking to all of you. And we collaborate. We collaborate with a lot of not-for-profits, with industry associations, with governments, with private entities to drive change in what we do. We are best known for Green Star. That's usually our outward-facing product. Green Star is a rating system for the built environment. It is holistic. It covers everything that you can think of, provided it doesn't move. So unfortunately, no Green Star ratings for cruise ships, despite the team really wanting to do the study tours. It usually sells that joke, Dave. That's what I'm saying. But we have rated pretty much everything that you can think of. The smallest Green Star rated project is about 30 square meters or something like that. Like it's a tiny coffee shop in Barangaroo. The biggest one is, I still think, is Aura in Queensland. It's in Caloundra, and it's a village of 25,000, 50,000 people, something like that. So that's going to be, that gives you a sense of the range of everything that we can do. We used to be very well known for doing offices. That's no longer the case. We used to also be very well known for doing new buildings, also no longer the case. So we have 5 now core rating tools. We just introduced a 5th one this past year. We have Green Star Communities, which is for precincts. We have Green Star Design and As-Built, or now known as Green Star Buildings, which is a revision to the rating tool. And we have Green Star Fit-Outs, which is for, as you imagine, for new fit-outs, and Green Star Performance, which is actually our most widely used rating tool, but a lot of people don't know about that, which is for existing buildings operations. So collectively, we have something like 3,250 buildings certified, and pretty much every major property owner, tenant, and at this point, government entity uses or requires Green Star in some way. Some big key examples that you might be familiar with or not. This is 25 King Street in Brisbane. It was at the time, or for a long time, Australia's largest mass timber building. It's a beautiful building if you've ever been there. You had the chance to be there. And I think it's 9 or 10 stories tall from memory. Can't remember exactly. It was finished about 5 or 6 years ago, I want to say. We also have Daramo House in Barangaroo. This became now Australia's largest office building that's made out of mass timber, which I thought was a good thing to bring around. There's actually 2 now. There's one next to each other. They're both built with timber. It's gorgeous. And then there will be Atlassian Central, which, if you don't know anything about it, it's going to be a big tower by Atlassian that is going to be owned by Dexus. And one of the key things about the tower is going to be one of the largest mixed timber structures in the world. And what that means is that there's going to be a sandwich of timber structure between a collection of structural concrete elements. The tower is going to be, I think, 45 stories tall, give or take. It's an incredible design. They're still working on it, so it might change, but the principle of how it's being designed and built is obviously quite impressive. Significant savings in embodied carbon emissions that will happen in that building just because of its construction method compared to a typical 47-odd story office building. So let's look at what's driving all of this. Now, when we look globally, if we step back, the built environment has a lot of impacts worldwide. There are approximately, built environment is around 39% of global emissions. In Australia, it's a little bit smaller, but it's still significant. Buildings are responsible for 50% of global material use. And if you think about it, you spend pretty much most of your life inside a building. And therefore, that means that it affects your health and well-being to an extreme degree. Very few other things in your environment are going to affect your health and well-being as much as a building. So if you look at it from this perspective, you can see why there's a lot of focus on improving the built environment. In Australia, as I've said, the statistics are broadly similar, but they're just as impactful. And I'll go a little bit into how how a building's emissions profile should be considered. When you look at the World Economic Forum as well, they publish a report. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. They publish a report every year, which is essentially the the World Economics Forum Global Risks Report. And what they do is they go and ask something like 1,000 people, I think, at this point. And it's 1,000 CEOs and influencers and scientists and everyone that they can get their hands on that has something valuable or important to say or keen elements. And what they say is these are the global risks that we're seeing come our way. They rate two things, actually. They look at the likelihood of something happening and the impact of something happening. And this year, for the first time, they said, what are the risks that you're seeing, which is this? And they asked them, where do you see the risks move there? And what's fascinating, of course, is seeing how these risks are transforming into very clear risks that impact and drive the built environment, unquestionably. There's no way around it. So effectively, what this is telling us is we are effectively at the core of everything that will be happening in terms of impacts. We will either be impacted by things very directly, or we are impacting things very directly as well. Now, we group all of these three things into three strategic areas from the Green Building Council of Australia. All of our work is based out of these three strategic areas, and these three strategic areas are also based on work that has been done globally by the World Green Building Council. And then out of these three big strategic priorities, we bring them down to 9 topical areas. And to be honest, if you want to understand a lot of what's going on in the built environment, this is your Bible. Pretty much everything that's going on, everything that buildings are doing, that investors are doing, that the REITs are doing, you can probably broadly summarize them in here, even our own rating system. What this means, of course, is that when you look at the impacts of the supply chain and how it's being fit, it's very easy to sort of look at it and say, those are the 3 elements, but actually there are elements that happened throughout in the other areas as well. But it's a good framework for you to think about. Now, let's look very specifically then at the products and materials aspect of the built environment. And when we look at climate action, buildings do account for 40% of energy-related, about 39% of energy-related global emissions. 25% of those emissions are specifically related to products and materials. That's a really big number. The additional element to that 25% is that it can only be affected at one singular point in time, which is at the construction of the building. Once you've built that building, those emissions are gone. And I'm going to be saying that a lot today, but it is very important to understand that 40% of energy-related carbon emissions, as the grid decarbonizes, that amount will drop. But you cannot change that 25% unless you change the supply chain and unless you change how you design buildings at the beginning. And when you look at resources and circularity, as I've said, 50% of it is going to buildings. That's everything, right? Concrete, steel, timber, mostly. That would account for a significant portion of that. So what are we seeing? We're seeing these 4 trends. We are seeing a dwindling amount of virgin material resource. So there's a lot more pressure being put in on that resource. There's a lot more pressure being put in trying to find ways of recovering resources from the supply chain and the built environment. There is now a lot of incentives starting to happen or starting to be spoken about in terms of what governments are driving to change the emissions profiles of products and materials. Europe, for example, is looking to introduce a carbon border tax. Right? If you import anything to Europe and it is not it's above a certain threshold of carbon emissions, you will pay an extra tax, right? That immediately puts Australia in a very dangerous situation if you're importing everything to that country, to that continent. And so there's an increased focus on emissions. What we're seeing is that to be able to be successful for a sustainable global economy, we have to take all of these things into consideration. And that's what we're trying to do in the built environment. That's what we're trying to do with Green Star. That's what we're trying to help with. We've gone and asked building and product manufacturers what is it that they want from us, from the Green Building Council. We're very curious about that. And what they've said to us a number of times over and over again is The world is changing a lot, which is true. And we don't know how to respond to it. We don't know what our role is, and we don't know what to do. So we need you, GVCA, to help us. So that's what we're trying to do now. We very much started now looking at products and materials with a much more specific and strategic focus that we have in the past. And what you'll see me talking about for the rest of the presentation is how Green Building Council is going to help manage through these transitions. A few years back, I want to say before the pandemic, those were the days, actually right before the pandemic from memory, we actually published this document, which is a circular economy discussion paper. What we did is we partnered with Edge Environment, who helped us do a survey of the built environment. We went and spoke to, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like 50 individuals, and then we had an open survey, and we had like 100 responses. And we asked them, what is a circular economy for you? What does it mean for you? What do you understand as a circular economy? What are you doing as in the space? And what we wanted to know is where people's understanding were. It was very interesting. What we found was that most people don't understand it. Most people don't know what it is or conceptually know what it is, but don't know how to translate it into anything that they can work with. They do also look at it in terms of waste. So they're seeing the circularity aspect of how they control the waste going out of their streams, not necessarily how they're picking things up on the other end. But they do think it's a growing area of concern. And we are actually seeing this shift. So if you were to ask us, say, 15 years ago, or right when I started the Green Building Council, the environmental movement was very much predicated on efficiency. Let's use less energy, let's use less water, let's do less bad things. We've moved then into a model of sustainability, right? Let's really look at how to make sure that we're not doing any damage, but let's also expand our scope so that it's not just about being efficient, but about trying to do good in some way. What we're now seeing is everyone moving to this space, which is about an integrated strategy. And it is not just about products and materials, but it is about thinking about all of your actions and how they're impacting what you do. And you may have heard other terms for this stuff, like regenerative design and so on, but it's part of the same piece. So much so that the World Resources Institute is expecting that in the future, a key C-level title in a lot of companies is going to be Chief Circularity Officer, and it might replace a Chief Sustainability Officer. We've been looking at doing all of this work throughout what feels like a long time, 5 years, where we've been publishing a number of documents throughout. We put out 4 discussion papers that are trying to give all of this content to everyone. And we haven't really had, up to about a year ago, a paper that actually discloses this and takes it to a product manufacturing level. That's something we're working with. But ultimately, all of this is leading us to this conclusion. This is our strategy, effectively. We want to be able to say that we want to work with you to transform the supply chain. As an organization, we have transformed parts of the supply chain, but we haven't sat down with you and figured out how to do this properly. And unfortunately for us, it took us 20 years to convince people that maybe having inefficient light bulbs in buildings was a bad idea. We have a lot less time to convince everyone that having bad products in buildings are a bad idea. A lot less time. So we have to do this at 3 times the speed that we did the past 25 years worth of work. What we want is healthy, zero carbon, low emissions or low toxic waste, low impact materials, sorry. Healthy, zero carbon, low impact materials that are ready for a circular economy. That's the goal. That's what we have to do. And we need to drive them really, really fast. We also need to figure out how to influence the entirety of the supply chain, not just have better products. That's key. We've gotten really good at having the green product in a production line that has other products. Those exist, and GVCA has been just as guilty as anyone of promoting that conversation. We have to move to a situation where the manufacturer is green as well, and all of its products are green, and we have to do it very quickly. So we're going to be driving, within our 4 areas of activities, we're going to be driving these topics. We ourselves are going to be advocating for government, and we've already started, to work with them to drive certain pilot programs, to drive better incentives, and to drive programs to help domestic product manufacturers get up to speed and work hard on these issues. As an example, we've partnered with the South Australian government to develop a circular economy discussion paper specific for how to turn the built environment in South Australia a lot more circular. And that's currently happening. We are creating more education courses and events, specifically for product manufacturers and suppliers. And we are working with product certification schemes to try and drive and understand what does a long-term future look like so that they are also moving in that direction, not just in Australia, but globally. And finally, through Green Star, we're trying to drive change. We're trying to encourage these things to happen as well. We're trying to make sure that there's a business demand for that change, at least initially voluntarily, until we can get to the point where we can introduce it in a regulatory setting. So, as I've said, we can put all of this together in one place, but broadly speaking, what we're looking to do is big local partnerships. We know we have global supply chains. We want to drive change with other entities domestically and worldwide, and we need to figure out how to transform the conversation, not just to be about green products, which they will still matter, they're the thing that has the impact, but also to green manufacturers. We have to start recognizing both of them. What are we doing in Green Star? We've actually partnered with Corio to help develop a circular economy leadership challenge that's available now. We're trying to make people understand what the circularity look like at the building level. We're also working to develop circularity metrics for the product level, and that doesn't mean necessarily coming up with new ones. It means looking and doing a scan overseas, looking what are the right ones and bringing those to Australia. We're working with product certification schemes. We want them to start incorporating circularity. We're going to be recognizing more products such as cradle to cradle. We're working with, for instance, David on a global green tax line of certification schemes to recognize the ones that we hadn't recognized in the past, like product health declarations. We're looking at the recognition of responsible wood. We recognize the most recent review because that was an actual significant update to the standard, and we're having a more distinct level of strategies on products. So in the past 2 years, I want to say, we've been working on revising all of Green Star. Green Star Buildings is now the rating tool for new building construction. There's still about 500 buildings under the old rating tool, but everyone else is now registering under this one. We launched Green Star Homes. I won't speak about Green Star Homes today. It is a very different rating tool to the other Green Star rating tools, and right now the materials aspect is not as developed as we'd like it to be on purpose. And performance should be coming out in about a month. Communities is the next one, right off the, should be 2023. And we put a bit of a parking, we parked interiors or fit outs, as we're going to call it, mostly because of the pandemic. So we needed to see what shook up before we went out and did anything with it, but we're now actively working on it. We'll come up with a date at some point soon. I'm going to talk about buildings, but everything that I speak about buildings will matter for the other rating tools in some way or at some point. What are we doing with Green Star Buildings? What's different about Green Star Buildings? And if you don't know what's different about Green Star Buildings, I will tell you right now, it is a radically different rating tool. We started the process. We went to our board and said about 5 years ago and said, hey, what if we think we need to do a new version of Green Star or start planning for it. It takes about 6 years, every 6 years or so, we like to release a new version. We think it's a major overhaul, but shouldn't be too significant. Rating tools there. Probably we're going to fix about 20% and maybe add an extra category or like 5 extra credits. We did the opposite of that. We kept about 20% of the rating tool and everything else is new. And that's because things have changed significantly. The rating tool has an obsession to responding with climate science, particularly so. I won't go into it, but if you want to get a Green Star rating right now, it has to be a fully electric building, fully powered by renewables, significantly low energy demand, and a reduction in upfront carbon emissions. Those requirements start for 5-star rated buildings in January this year. It's built into the rating tool. We actually have to stop ourselves from doing that. Right? It's on a trajectory. It is going to decarbonize the built environment by 2030. But the two ones that I'm going to be talking about, or the one that I'm going to be talking about, is mostly around supply chain transformation. There are two things that the rating tool is trying to do, and this strategy will roll over the other rating tools for what it's worth. One is to create a drive for low carbon products. We are trying to reduce the upfront carbon emissions of buildings in Australia. That is something that 5 years ago you would not have heard anyone say. It now feels like no one will stop talking about it, but that is absolutely something that needs to happen, and we're partnering with neighbors to do some work around this space, and we've been part of the MECLA founding working group as well. And we want to drive a definition of responsible products. In a lot of ways, we keep looking at products and we keep trying to saying, is it a locally produced product? Is it a low carbon product? Is it a low toxic product? But in fact, it's the combination of everything. And things like Global Green Tech, I'll keep pointing to David because he's here, but things like Global Green Tech had that approach, right? So let's use that, let's actually push it to the next level, and let's help everyone drive better outcomes through that. So we created something that we call the Responsible Products Framework. For those of you who are wondering, this is the new rating tool. And if you're familiar with the old rating tool, it should look very different. If you're not, it's always looked like this. The key thing, of course, is how expansive it is in its ambition. You'll notice, for example, it has a very strong social sustainability focus. It has a very strong nature focus, right? It's got a place-making aspect that before it didn't care about. And that's what it's trying to drive, right? It's trying to drive effectively healthy, resilient, and positive places for people and nature built responsibly and showcasing leadership. It does exactly what it's meant to say. So the ones in green are products that are some of the credits that are in the rating tool related to how the building behaves, right? We want reductions in upfront carbon emissions at the building level. We look at life cycle impacts at the building level. We look at toxins at the product level, but it's really at the end of the day what happens in the space. Those red ones over there are very specific to what we're trying to do at a product level. So that rewards products. And you'll notice we divided them in very different ways. We used to have a timber credit, we used to have a steel credit, we used to have a concrete credit. We no longer have that. We have functional credits, and that's on purpose. Going back to what does it mean? What we're trying to do with Green Star buildings and the other rating tools is essentially cancel out everything from here all the way down to there, right? Refrigerants, we are touching them, but they're on their way of very specific decarbonization pathway. If we don't do much, they'll get taken care of very quickly. And those things are system level issues that are a little bit hard to deal with. But that's your upfront carbon emissions, pretty much most of that. And we're trying to decarbonize everything else here through other means. And just in terms of what you're asking me, this is for a potential building in Sydney on Thursday, sun's shining, that's the emissions. If you move it to Melbourne, the emissions will look different. If you move it to New York, it'll look different, but the broad proportion is mostly the same, right? Your major input will always be electricity, followed by gas, and about a quarter of your building's emissions, depending on how clean your grid is, will be the upfront carbon emissions. This is what I mean about trying to drive new changes in buildings. If you want to get a 6-star rating, you got to do that, right? And that is what we call our climate positive pathway. In January 2023, that same thing applies to 5-star rated buildings. And in 2026, that same thing applies to 4-star rated buildings. That's on purpose. That's already set in place because we want industry to be aware of, you got to work on helping the built environment do this. Those don't look like big numbers. They're really hard to achieve. We also separated the responsible products credits into these 4 areas. And the reason being, that's broadly speaking, the replacement cycles, right? So if you look at how buildings are considered, you look at replacement cycles of things, it actually makes sense to look at it in the context of this perspective because we're trying to say, get the best structure. You only do it once, give or take. Right? Pick your steel, pick concrete, pick timber, pick the best one, but you don't compare or shouldn't be trying to offset the impact of your structure with the impact of your mechanical building services. That makes no sense. So that's what we're trying to do. We're looking at a functional element of the building. In Green Star buildings, you have to get 50% of your products must be considered to be good practice. What does good practice mean? We actually define in the rating tool, you need to achieve certain product certification schemes or combination of other initiatives. For responsible envelope, 30% of the products have to be good practice. Why is there a difference? Very few products involved here, a lot of products involved there. We're having to adjust for the fact that the supply chains are at different maturity levels. When you look at responsible systems, 20%, that feels very low, but trust me, there are like 5 environmental product declarations in Australia for mechanical, energy, and plumbing systems. So that's a problem. That's high, that's hard, but we didn't feel right to bring it any lower. And 40% for responsible finishes, same deal, there's a lot of things that go into a building, we have to account for that. And we do have other options to give you more points depending on what you're doing. Whether it's a combination of more product or better practice. We have 2 levels essentially. When we talk about the responsible products framework, these are the 5 things that we care about. We care that your product is responsible, that it is healthy, that it is positive, and that it is circular. In a nutshell, we don't, however, assess products. GBCA does not assess products. If you come to us and say, I want to assess my product, we will tell you, yes, that sounds like a great idea. There's a list of entities that can help you, do that. Go and talk to them. What we've done is we've scored the entities, right? Because that's not our job. We are not product certification schemes. People like David's Global Green Tag are, or Good Environmental Choice Australia, or Responsible Wood. There's a ton of entities that we're recognizing, and we're bringing more online as quickly as we can so that the scope is increased. Right now, there's probably about twice as many things that we've recognized in Green Star buildings as being compliant than there would have been on Green Star Design and As-Built. That's on purpose. So however, it's still important for you as a product manufacturer to understand what are the things we GBCA care about, because those are the things that we want product certification schemes to also care about, and that's why we're working with them. Now, we're still working on some of this stuff, but broadly speaking, this is what the framework looks like. It is an evolving framework. It is intended to move as we get better information or as we get better metrics. So for example, the circular aspects, they'll probably expand as well. But that's fine. We are working with the people who are assessing products to drive this change. We've actually laid all of this out in that paper. We went out and said, this is what we think we're going to be doing for products and materials. Hopefully this is helpful to people. I encourage you to go and download it. It is on our website. And we will be publishing more material as time goes on. We now have a dedicated person on products and materials. It's the first time we've had one in a while. And that's the intention, is to help industry understand where we're going. Because the key thing about the way we've set up things is in the future, we will be adjusting the credits to go higher. But we know that for us to come in and say, surprise, the credits are now harder for your products is very unfair. If you don't know what you have to work around, you don't know what you're targeting. So that's what we're trying to do. We're going to give you a roadmap. We're going to be publishing a roadmap of how we expect this space to evolve in the rating tools. And the challenging piece is trying to coordinate that in some way with other entities overseas, because we're going to try and sing from the same song sheet for the first time in this space. So that's going to happen. We're hoping that we can put something out this year that actually gives you an idea of what the next 2 revisions of the rating system will look like, so that if you're starting to work on a new strategy, you're not working to next year's proposal, you're working to 2030's proposal, because that's really where you should be working for. You need to be thinking long term. That's probably it for me. I don't know if there's any other questions or thoughts. Very happy to answer any questions that anyone will have. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for that fantastic presentation, Jorge. We've got a few questions that are filtered through on the live stream, so I might actually ask a few of those, and we'll actually support them with Vanda's got a roving mic that she's going to run through the crowd with. So if you've got any questions, please raise your hand. So I might just go with one of the live stream questions to start with, Jorge. Yep. We've got Javid from Fiji, so Bulla. And just one question before I ask the question. In Fiji, if you wanted a Green Star project, would that go through the GBCA or would it go through the NZ to GBC?
They cannot.
Oh, okay.
Green Star is very much focused on driving change in Australia. Yep. In New Zealand, they also use Green Star. They're very much focused on driving change in New Zealand. There are other solutions for them in Fiji. I don't know what they might be, but they cannot use Green Star in Fiji.
Fantastic. Well, I've got the first question I've got from him logging in for the event from Fiji is, you mentioned the Altasian building that you highlighted.
Yes.
Yeah. Whereabouts was that?
That's in Sydney. That's on top of Central Station. That is a whole regeneration project that they're doing for Central Station. That's one of the key big developments. You can find a lot of information about it online. It's a pretty cool project.
Fabulous. Vanda?
We've got Chris.
Yeah, fantastic presentation. Thank you. Look, I'm just wondering, with the ratings tool, is this something that's in-house through you, or are the designers using this tool as well?
Oh no, I don't design anything or build anything, as I'm fond of saying. The designers use. Usually a building owner or a tenant or a government entity will say, I want to occupy a building, I want to lease the space. It needs to have a 4, 5 or 6-star Green Star rating, and the developer or the building owner will then spec out a building that delivers that to them. That's how it works. And so there's about 3, it's completely independent from us. We do the assessment though, so they do submit the documentation to us so that they actually provide us, so we then pass it on to an independent assessor who then looks at that. So we don't assess, but the owner, the building owner or the consultant team also don't assess, an independent entity assesses from them. And that's how the rating gets determined.
Vanda, we've got another question on the live stream first.
Sure.
So you mentioned, for example, product certification and, for example, the Responsible Products Framework, which we're very excited about Responsible. But what we got a call coming through is, how important do you think timber actually has an important role to actually drive the push towards circular?
Yep.
And what sort of implication will it have for projects that use certified timber in terms of Green Star points?
Great question. I'll separate out the last bit of the question because that's the easy bit. So we do recognize responsible wood or FSC certification to be perfectly transparent for timber products. Those get recognized as good practice in the rating tool, and that means that that's what we're looking for when it comes to timber, effectively in buildings. So that helps. As to how timber will help in the drive to circular economy, it is, I think, an incredible solution that we can use. Also one that we have to be very careful with, because it is very easy for the built environment, if we're not careful, to raise every forest in the world.
Yep.
So we have to be responsible about the type of timber that you're bringing in. You have to understand where it's coming from, the context where it's coming from. That's where certifications like Responsible Wood or FSC matter, because we can run the risk of doing something very, very wrong, effectively. And a good example of that is what's happened with, say, palm oil, where it's very easy to raise entire forest for something that is not worth what we're doing to the environment. Having said that, wood has a lot of benefits. It is a carbon store, so we can use it from that perspective. The more forests we grow, the better. If we can take those responsibly managed forests, turn them into structural components and lock the carbon that way, that's a benefit for everyone involved. And of course, timber decomposes, so there's a value from the circularity element. Or it can last for a long time. There are buildings in Europe that are built out of timber that are still existing that are definitely older than I am.
That was a great presentation. Thank you. I'm just wondering, in your presentation, you talk about 6-star, but we're now at 7-star.
No, we're not.
Very soon.
No.
I understand. No?
What you're referring to is a completely different system.
Okay. Would you mind explaining that?
Absolutely. So there is a system in Australia called NatHERS, which is the National Housing Energy Rating Scheme. NatHERS has nothing to do with the aspects that we cover, except for the performance of the thermal envelope of the house, as in how efficient that is, how well insulated it is. And therefore, what that has on the influence of the house's energy consumption. That's all it is. That one does go from 1 to 10 stars. Why we all picked stars? Sorry? Yeah. So NatHERS does go from 1 to 10 stars, but legally, you're only allowed now to build a house from 6 to 10 stars, which makes perfect sense. And of course, assuming things go well, the code will change, so it goes from 7 to 10 stars. So they are just annoyingly stars, but wildly different stars. So that's important, yeah. But I understand completely the confusion, trust me. It's like we specifically wanted to. Yes?
Any more questions?
We've got one on the live that's just come in as well. And that is, how does the GBCA work with furniture providers to get more interior projects certified?
That's actually something we're going to start working soon. So we're going to start working with specifically fit-out suppliers, so furniture, fittings, finishes, because we start ramping up for Green Star fit-outs. One thing we didn't quite do very well when we released Green Star buildings is we didn't do as deep engagement as we should have done on products. That's something we're trying to change for fit-outs to make sure that there is a supply chain that is available for when that rating tool comes out, and that is ready or ready-ish as best as we can. So we are working towards that. We will be doing things like introducing a product directory, for example, that enables people to understand what products do well in Green Star because they have Global Green Tag, or because they have Gecko, or they have responsible wood, so that it starts becoming a place where people can find this information easier. And we're also going to be doing some workshops and sessions to try and understand how to help to help product manufacturers or suppliers in the furniture space, especially not necessarily the top tier product manufacturer space, but the next set of tiers down, so that they understand what they have to do.
Great. We've got another question here.
Great presentation. Thanks. My name is Viju from Intrax Consulting. My question is, Green Star, is it regulated at the moment?
No.
Is there any? So there is no legal requirement?
No, it's all voluntary. We've been very successful at moving entire markets by just going to people and saying, what if you did the right thing? And people going, go on. And then attaching dollars to it, which also helps, because then tenants are the ones asking for it. There's a market demand. So Green Star itself is not regulated. Annoyingly, NAPHERS is. And there is another system which also uses stars, which confusingly also does 1 to 6, which is very popular in the non-residential sector, which is called Neighbors. And they have four certification schemes: energy, water, waste, and IE. But all of that integrates into Green Star, right? So Neighbors' schemes are inputs into Green Star. That's regulated as well.
Yeah. I was going to say, Hor, the interesting thing is if you ever see a commercial office with a lease sign on it, they legally have to provide their NABERS rating as well. So.
Yeah, they have to. It's the law, and that's fine. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Jorge,
Yes.
Just a question. In relation to the analysis of these designs, I know that years ago it used to be the design itself, but never on completion. And I did actually see a lot of buildings being completed that didn't actually include a lot of the components that they said they had on the initial design that gave them that rating, and yet they were publicising how wonderful they were, yet in reality they only had a small percentage of what they said they were actually going to have. So are we now looking at reviewing, is it now also as it's built?
It's been like that since 2014.
Excellent.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
So we've changed the
very
rules
important.
for the rating tool from since 2014, where you what you actually are doing is an assessment of the finished asset. The design review, as we called it, and now we just call it the designed, Green Star designed, is just an assessment on progress. That's all it is, and commitment.
Awesome.
But the actual certification is at the time of construction, and they cannot use the brand if they're not certifying at the time of construction.
So you say you don't assess the product yourself and you refer to external certification product entities, but how do you compare apple and egg, knowing that they are quite different, all those external certification? For example, Declare will be a bit more about the red list, and the chemical FSC will be about responsible wood sourcing, like they're completely different. So I don't know if you have a set benchmark for the product we have to meet. How do you assess it is a responsible product, and what do you look in? Do you look at chemicals content? Do you look at I don't quite get it.
Let's go there. So that list, I think, I want to say 40, I think it's 45 points, essentially, distributed across all of these things. So let's see, chemicals of concern actually is worth 5 points and so on. So we actually go and score all of them. And what we've done is to get to a good product, effectively, you have to get to, depending on the credit, you have to get to 10. Right, so there's a lot of space. And the reason we've done that is because some certification schemes, like, say, Responsible Wood, were focused on sourcing. Some others, like Global Green Tag, had a wide variety of things. And that's sort of how they were set up. So we couldn't necessarily say everyone has to comply with this, because that would be incredibly unfair. But what we're trying to do is say, this is a list that are the built environment, and this isn't GVCA, right? We've worked hard to develop these lists, are the things that they're concerned about. They are concerned about chemicals of concern. They are concerned about modern slavery. They are concerned about social accountability. As different schemes evolve over time, what we're trying to say is you do need to look at this list and start growing towards that. And as a product manufacturer, you should be looking at this list and set out your requirements around that. And so what we do is we look at holistic schemes, and they do well in here. Or we look at, say, climate active, which is only about carbon neutral certification. And we go, what can we pair climate active certification with to give something that gives you at least the right information. So you take, say, climate active, you pair it with product health declaration, you have the health aspect, you have the carbon aspects, that actually gives you something, and that gives you a number, that at least we can say that is a good product. And over time, that number will grow.
Some product will be better in certain area,
Yeah,
but less good in others.
Exactly.
So,
and over time, what we want to do is elevate that benchmark so that all of these things start becoming, I'm not going to say mandatory, but effectively the options start becoming smaller. One of the things that we're looking to do, for example, as we get through a lot of work we have to do with our online system, is to be able to then generate a responsible product report. And so we would be then looking at a building and being able to say, based on your responsible product choices, you emphasized these impacts, right? So we collate all of the products you have, we do all of this work, and it turns out you really cared about health. And that's all we're saying. We're not making a judgment call, we're just giving you valuable information about that. And that helps people start to understand what the impacts are at the product level, but also at the aggregate level, which is very valuable. Yeah.
We've got time for a couple of more questions. Yep.
So in terms of what drives designers and building owners to be more responsible, what are the drivers besides goodwill? And trying to do the right thing and contribute to the future and what have you.
Which shouldn't be minimized. I know we all go like, aside from doing the goodwill, but it does matter. People do care, we find. But there's a few key things. Investor demand. Investors are looking for a flight to quality, right? They are looking for better assets. They're looking for better performing assets. So what happens when you're able to demonstrate that good, sustainable assets are better performing assets financially? You're tying the issue of quality to sustainability, and that's one aspect. Second aspect, tenants. A tenant or an occupant, you want to go into a building and know that it's going to cost you less to run, or that it won't be like polluting the airspace that you're breathing, right? It's giving you good air. That it's not doing that allows you to attract employees. And so that means that there's now two sides to the question. One, investors wanting to invest in your project because it's a good project, and them looking and seeing, hey, turns out tenants are actually going around saying, we want better buildings, and they're looking for better buildings, and they will pay probably more for better buildings, or what's happening now, they will discount bad buildings, right? And so they will now penalize bad buildings, and that's what's happening. So those are the two sides of the equation. There's other regulatory impacts. The ASX, for example, has regulatory disclosure statements that speak about what impacts they're having on the world, and so that means they have to respond to that. There's also the transparency element that shareholders are asking for. So you package all of that, and you have a pretty good idea for why commercially it makes sense or starts making sense to drive these assets that way.
So what you're saying is that it's market driven.
Of course, 100%.
So our so-called leaders in government have zero role in setting a compliant environment to set the country up better, or?
No, government plays a very different role. So what we're trying to do is create the conditions for change. I'll give you an example. In 2019, the National Construction Code increased the energy efficiency section for commercial office buildings. That's called Section J. And it increased Section J from the last time it moved it, which was 2012, I want to say. And in 2019, 7 years later, they finally moved it up. And the difference in that gap, right, the change was something like 35% increase. That's huge, right? From 1 year to the other, you have to do a building that's 35% more. The reason why they were able to do that is because we were able to demonstrate through all of the Green Star rated projects that we had that the performance of buildings was increasing. And so the arguments for changing that benchmark were a lot easier to do than, say, in housing, where it's proven to be a genuine problem. Like the government has asked, I'd say, I don't know, 3 times to move the Nather star rating from 6 stars to 7 stars, and every time it gets shut down. And that's because those conditions haven't existed. So we help create the conditions for government to move, and that's what we're trying to do. But they do play a very important role.
It's interesting, actually, because at our Building Circular Australia event, which we had in Sydney a few weeks ago, we very thankfully had Devana, who provided the presentation. She was talking about she was talking about the implications that green loans from banks, for example, are providing incentives in the residential sector as well to try to push those changes through as well.
And that's essentially what happens, right? Government's role, the government as a say procurer of built environment assets, as an owner of built environment assets, they are actually surprisingly good at setting a high threshold of performance. We're working with schools in New South Wales. We're rating something like 80-odd schools, right? And that's not something that was done 10 years ago. They are actually doing better. But the government, as a minimum legislative requirement, they always want to do better. I've never been in a conversation with government that goes, well, we could drive better outcomes, but we don't want to. They always try and do that. But it's then they get the pressure from industries for good reasons to perhaps not make those changes, or bad reasons to not make those changes. What we try and do is create the conditions so that they can do that. But the government plays a dual role. There is a procurer of built assets, that role that they play, infrastructure, buildings, and so on, and as a setting of minimum practice policy. And once you understand that, you understand a lot of moves that government do. But they do play a very strong role.
So, on behalf of everyone here today, I'd like to thank Jorge for providing his very, very interesting presentation today. And we'll see everyone back at about 10:30.